Good morning. Full disclosure, I'm in an empty room. Doors shut. There's no one in here but me. That's why I'm not wearing a mask or a face shield. So, chapter one, the scientific study of life. Uh, I'm going to figure out why everything is mirrored, and hopefully by the next time, this will not be a problem. However, since you have these PowerPoints, you can always look at them and listen to me as I prattle on about biology. So, what is biology? Biology is the study of life, and I realize this slide is going off the edge of the screen. Not anything I can do about that. But life is everywhere. We know it when we see it, but sometimes it can be difficult to define. We will study all forms of life. We will talk about those as we get to them, and each individual living thing is referred to as an organism. All organisms are made up of cells, be they one-celled organism or multi-celled organisms. A single-celled organism, such as this amoeba right here, we refer to biologically and scientifically as a unicellular organism. Things like the mouse over here on the right-hand side, they're more complex, made up of multiple cells, and we refer to those things as multicellular. Wrong mouse button, sorry. All organisms are made up of DNA. DNA is the molecule that carries your genetic information. The reason I used to have brown hair back when I had hair is because my parents had the genetics for brown hair. That is, you don't pass on genes that you don't have. If you have a gene, you can pass that on to your offspring. Even a trait that you may not show is possible to be passed on to offspring. Those traits are called recessive, and we will talk about the difference between dominant and recessive in a subsequent lecture in a little bit later chapter. Life is defined by its characteristics. Here in a few minutes, we're going to talk about several things that set life apart from non-living things. One of the big issues with viruses, and we've all heard of viruses with coronavirus running around. We've all been hearing viruses for a little over a year now, really in the news. But scientifically, viruses are not considered to be living things. And we will talk about why that is when we get further on down the line in the chapters later on in the text. So how do we know the difference between living and non-living things? Well, all living things are going to share a set of characteristics. And we're going to talk about those in a few minutes. And there are some things that, characteristics that some living things show and some don't. If you see, it says all forms of life share, and again, it runs off the side of the screen there, and it says all of a common set of characteristics. And I caution you, anytime you're looking at science, don't use the words all, every, and always very often, because as a professor of mine at UALR many years ago told me, anytime you use the word all, the words all, always, and every in a science class, you're going to wind up finding an exception, and you're going to have to go take your word back. So virtually all forms of life share all of these characteristics, but there are some that may lack to show one or two of them. But if something possesses the majority of those characteristics, we consider it to be alive or a living entity. Characteristics of life. All characteristics of life have an organization, and we'll talk about each one of these in more depth in just a moment. But organization, they all have some level of organization. They all must attain and use energy. Attain, I mean gather it in and get it. Use it, we all know what we mean when we say use it. Internal constancy. Living things must maintain a relatively stable internal environment. We know that the human body the internal temperature is around 97.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, excuse me, 37 degrees Celsius. All living things must have the ability to reproduce, grow, and develop. And we'll talk about, again, each one of these in turn as we get to it. And then finally, evolution. There is not a more controversial subject that we could talk about in a biology class than evolution. And most of that is because people don't fully understand what is meant by the term evolution. Most people think that evolution means monkeys turned into human beings. And that is absolutely not what the term evolution means. Evolution simply means, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a few minutes, evolution simply means changing over time, that organisms are going to change over time. The example I use in my classes when I'm seeing face-to-face and I have students sitting before me is to watch British television. There's a wonderful TV show on British television. It's called Midsummer Murders. I love detective stories. And it is a story about murders that occur in the small, quaint villages and hamlets of England. And one of the most interesting things you see is when they go into these 125, 130-year-old homes that are still in existence in the countryside in England, everybody has to duck to go into the doors. All of these detectives and forensics people that are 5'10", 5'11", they all have to duck to go into the door. Well, why in the world did they build their houses with doors that were only about 5'9" to 5'10" tall? Because that's how tall people were 150 years ago. They were just that. They weren't the stature we are today. Another piece of history, trivia for you, everybody always refers to Napoleon Bonaparte of France as being short. Napoleon actually wasn't short. He was 5'7", which was average height for that time. But all the pictures of him, he appears to be short because to sort of increase his street cred, he always surrounded himself with the tallest of the soldiers he had. So he always had these big 6'1", 6'2" guys standing around him, and he's 5'7", so he looks very, very short. Well, he wasn't. That's just another cultural myth. All right, so organization. This is the characteristics of life. This is where we start off. We start off with the atom, and again, we're going to talk more and more about this as we go on today. You take some atoms and put them together and make a molecule. You take a molecule and put several different molecules together, and you make what is called an organelle. An organelle is a membrane-bound structure that is designed to perform some task. A cell, we all know what a cell is. A cell is the smallest unit of life that is capable of performing all of the aspects of life. A tissue, you put a whole bunch of different cells together and you make a tissue. You put several tissues together and you make an organ. You make several organs together, you make an organ system. You put organ systems together and you make an organism. And then, excuse me, we get to some more terms that we use every day, but in biology they have a definite system or a definite meaning. And the first one of these is population. Now, we all know when we talk about the population of Pulaski County, Arkansas, we are talking about the number of people that live in Pulaski County. That is a modern, everyday usage of the term. For biology purposes, a population is the number of a specific species that lives in a confined geographic area. So if you think about, again, Pulaski County, yes, Pulaski County has a population of people, but it also has a population of oak trees and elm trees and rose bushes and tulip bushes and earthworms and dogs and cats and rats. Every living thing that exists in Pulaski County has a population. The next term biologically is community. Now, again, I live in Bryant, and I live in a little area which is called Emerald Valley. It's actually a subdivision, but some people would consider that a community. That's my community. So that's the everyday version, or the common man's descriptor of a community. Biologically, what a community is all the different species that live in that confined geographic area. So again, talking about Pulaski County, when you take the dogs, the cats, the rats, the earthworms, the oak trees, the elm trees, the tulips, the roses, and the people, and you put them all together, that makes the biological community. We move up the ladder to what is referred to as an ecosystem. An ecosystem is going to be all the communities and how they interact with a larger geographic area. And ecosystems are normally bordered or surrounded or separated, that's a better word, by climate. Think about the North Pole. That's an ecosystem called the Arctic. If you come just below the North Pole in the areas where there's just some little low grasses and no trees, and where the reindeer and the caribou live naturally, that is referred to as the tundra. If you come down into Arizona and New Mexico and parts of Utah, you're in a desert. If you're in Arkansas, we live in what is referred to as the eastern deciduous hardwood forest. Yeah, not a whole heck of a lot of deciduous hardwoods left in the eastern United States, because human beings have cut most of them down and replaced them with pine trees, which are neither deciduous nor hardwood. But historically, that's the name of our ecosystem. If you take all the different ecosystems and put them together and the way they interact with one another, you get what is referred to as a biosphere. And the biosphere upon which you and I live is referred to as Earth. So, how is life organized? First of all, we have the atom. The atom is the smallest chemical unit of a type of pure substance known as an element. The example drawn for you here is a carbon atom. You will have in your textbook a copy of the periodic table of elements. I'm actually going to only want you to remember 3 or 4 of those. We'll talk about them as they come, and one of them is carbon. You need to know carbon. If you take several atoms and you put them together, you make what is called a molecule. The example shown for you is DNA. One of the simpler molecules you can talk about is water. You take 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, you chemically combine them, and you make a molecule of water. A molecule is the smallest subdivision of a compound that still shows the characteristics of that compound. Organelles, again, as I said, it's a membrane-bound structure that has a specific function within a cell. The example shown for you there is a chloroplast. A chloroplast is the structure within the leaves of green plants, and it's also found in a few other places as well. But this is the site where most of the photosynthesis takes place. You know, that process where the plants have the ability to make their own food, it occurs in the chloroplast. You take a bunch of organelles and put them together and you make a cell. Again, the cell, the fundamental unit of life. Again, this happens to be a leaf cell from a plant. You can see lots of different organelles. This structure right here is the nucleus. There's a chloroplast there. There's another chloroplast there. This is a structure called the mitochondria. This is a structure called the Golgi. And later on in chapter 3 or 4, when we talk about the cell specifically, we'll talk about more and more of these components. But again, the smallest or fundamental unit of life. You put a bunch of cells together, different types of cells, and you make a tissue. This is a cross-section of a leaf. This is the top of the leaf here. These are called epidermal cells. These are called palisade cells. Again, don't worry about that. We may talk about that a little bit toward the end of the semester if we get there. These are called vascular bundles. Again, we'll talk about those later. This is a structure called a stomata, which is where the gases come in and the water vapor comes out. We'll talk all about that later. But again, this is a cross-section of a leaf showing multiple different types of cells to form a tissue. We put a bunch of tissues together and we make an organ. This organ just happens to be a leaf. What you've got here is you've got this, which is the tissue, and then you've got all these other structures. You've got this thing called the petiole, and this thing called the blade, and you've got this thing called veins. All things holding it together to make that one organ or the structure that has some function. And this one just so happens is a leaf. Excuse me for a moment. Then we move into an organ system. You take several different types of organs. I also teach anatomy. And in anatomy, we talk about the human body and we talk about the different organ systems. We'll talk about the respiratory system, the lungs, and the trachea, and all of that. This is an organ system. The organ system they are representing here by this picture is everything on the tree above the ground. So the trunk, the branches, the leaves, all of those things, different organs producing an organ system. So in this tree, you have the above ground component. Then we have an organism. Now we're talking about the whole tree, not only the above ground stuff, but the below ground stuff as well. This happens to be an acacia tree. This is the tree that the elephants and giraffes and other browsing animals in Africa really enjoy eating the leaves off the acacia trees. Excuse me. Then we have a population. Here's a whole group of acacia trees living in some savanna in Africa. Then we have a community. Now you see we have the acacia trees, but we also have a herd of elephants. Again, that's all the populations that live in the same region. Again, we're talking about the African savanna. The ecosystem, again, the living and non-living components of an area. The savanna, you see there's rocks and trees and scrub. A lioness perched on the rock waiting for some unsuspecting herbivore to come running by so she can take that down and feed her young. And then finally, we put all the ecosystems together and we form the biosphere that is our, ergo, there is life's organization. Now, organizations can lead us to what are referred to as emergent properties. These are things that arise from our different levels of biological organization. This is where components interact with each other to make us be able to function the way we function. Our brain works by sensing signals, interpreting those signals, and then developing a response to those signals. The brain sees a threat and analyzes the threat, and then we create or we respond to that threat. Those are, again, emergent properties. So that's the organization. That's the organization of living things. Energy. Energy is designed and needed to keep us organized. It takes energy to hold us together. What happens to things, and no, don't mean to be too graphic here, but what happens to things after they die? They eventually start to fall apart. That's because energy is no longer being put into those things, and the structures that are holding things together that require energy start to break down and fall apart. It's responsible to help carry out chemical reactions. You are nothing more than a series of chemical reactions. The reason I'm able to stand up here, wave my hands about, and yes, I talk with my hands a lot, and I'm able to think, and I'm able to talk, and I'm able to do all the things I can do is because I'm carrying out chemical reactions. Chemical reactions are happening which allow me to do the things I'm doing. Whoops, I was not ready to change that, sorry. Now I have to go backwards. Come on. Oh, I guess I've got to get rid of that screen first. Now I can go backwards. Okay, sorry about that. Transporting molecules into and among cells. Again, energy is involved. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of different ways in chapter 2. We're going to talk about a couple of different ways cells move things into and out of the cells. Some of them don't require energy. Some of them do. But energy is required, especially when you're talking about moving large things. That requires energy. And we'll talk about those processes. We have to maintain an internal constancy. Human beings, again, as I said a few minutes ago, have an internal temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius on average. If something happens and that temperature changes, then that can cause problems within the body. We have to maintain a certain internal constancy, and all living things have to do that. All living things don't do it exactly the same way, but they all have to do it. And finally, reproducing, growing, and developing. We all know what reproducing is. Growing and developing are two things that sort of go together, although not exactly. Human beings, for instance, we reach a point where we stop growing, but hopefully we never stop developing. Hopefully, most of you say are under 30. Hopefully, by the time you're my age, you're much wiser. You know much more about life than you do now. Hopefully, you don't stagnate today and stop developing. So, how do we gather energy? Well, there's several different ways to get energy. The first group of energy assemblers, or another good way is a good term, are things called producers. Now, primarily, producers are plant and plant-like things. The word producer literally tells us these are things that can produce their own energy. They have the ability to produce their own food. I'm air quoting the word food there. But these are producers, and again, there's plants, but there's also lots of other things. There's some fungi organisms. There are a few protist organisms. There are even some bacteria that are producers. But when we think of producers, we think of things that are making their own product. And again, here's the nice little primary producers. Extract energy and nutrients from the non-living environment. Consumers. We see an insect of some sort, looks like a member of the beetle family, consuming one of those leaves from this primary producer. The consumers are those things that have to get their nutrients from an outside source. In other words, they have to eat something. Lots of different ways that we can eat things, but we do it one way, other organisms do it a different way. But if you are a consumer, you do not have a capability of making your own food. You have to get your food from somewhere else. You have to consume it. And finally, there are decomposers. Some textbooks lump decomposers in with consumers. I like the way this particular textbook does it, and they actually take the decomposers out and give them their own group. Decomposers, while yes, they do consume their food, and they do consume it, but they do it externally. The reason, if you've ever suffered the malady of athlete's foot, and you know that in between your toes when you have the athlete's foot, it gets red and raw and irritated, scratchy and itchy. Well, the reason that's happening is because the fungus that is the athlete's foot is excreting digestive hormones that are breaking down the skin cells on your foot, and then that fungus is absorbing those into itself. It's basically consuming your toes, but it's doing so by decomposing your foot. That's why it itches and it scratches and it hurts. Decomposer. So you have three basic ways organisms obtain their energy. They can make it themselves, They can eat it directly, or they can break it down externally and absorb it. And that's energy. So, internal constancy. The term for an internally constant environment is referred to as homeostasis. If you take anatomy and physiology, you will spend a lot of time talking about homeostatic imbalances. That's an illness. Any illness is a homeostatic imbalance. Something's going on internally to mess up that internal balance. Human beings have an internal thermostat that helps us maintain temperature, but we also have ways that we can help it. The lady on the right looks like she's been running somewhere. She's sweaty, so she's drinking some water to help cool herself down. The young lady on the left, she's clearly out in the snow somewhere, so she's got a big heavy jacket on to help maintain her warmth. So we can do things to help. You can also, there are other body reactions. To cool us down, we sweat. To warm us up, we shiver. All of those things are ways to maintain our internal constancy. That's right. Okay, already seen that. Okay, so reproduction, growth, and development. All right, so organisms reproduce, grow, and develop. They all do that, and they do it in a variety of ways. One way is what is referred to as asexual reproduction. Anytime you place the letter A in front of a word, that means without or no. So asexual reproduction without sex. This is very common in plants. This is a strawberry plant. Here's the main plant right here. There is a botany term or a botanical term for these little things that run off. I call them runners. I'm not a botanist. I call them runners. I'm sure Miss Smiles, our botany teacher, would have another name for them. But what happens is these little runners go off, and then they will set up a new set of roots, and everywhere you see these little bunches of leaves, there will eventually be a new strawberry plant. That is asexual reproduction. That one plant is spreading out over time. And what you can do is, after these things start to take root, you can snip those little runners, and this plant down here will live on its own and not feed off this plant. As a matter of fact, if you want to have a really good strawberry crop, you have to do that, because as this plant is spreading out, it's taking more and more energy away from this to do all of this. And if it's using all its energy to do this, there's no energy to make strawberries. And after all, what's the point of planting strawberries and having a strawberry patch if you can't pick strawberries and have strawberries and cream, or strawberries and angel food cake, or whatever you put your strawberries on? Chocolate covered strawberries. Valentine's Day coming up. Has everybody placed their chocolate covered strawberry order, guys? Have you done that? Or ladies, for your significant others? Another type of reproduction is sexual reproduction. That's where you get two parents involved. That's what human beings do. That's what these swans did. See the two swans get together. You got the male and the female, and then they have the little baby swans. Another trivia question: baby swans are called cygnets. Cygnets. Crossword puzzle word. If anybody knows what a crossword puzzle is, I love crossword puzzles. Most plants and animals reproduce sexually. Yes, plants do in fact reproduce sexually, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. These young swans receive their genetics from their mom. If I remember correctly, if I remember my bird portion of undergraduate school correctly, the male swan is on the right, the female swan is on the left, and you can tell the difference by looking at their necks. You see how the male swan has the much more sort of candy cane shaped neck than the female does. And I remember, as I recall, that's one of the characteristics for telling them apart. But sexual reproduction. You get one cell from the father, one cell from the mother. It comes together, makes the baby. Development, growing and developing. Okay, the plantlets and the swans both started as single cells. All right. Two cells come together to form the first cell of the newborn, whichever. Then it starts to expand and grow, and as it expands and grows, it develops. So development, growth, basically, if you think about things getting bigger and the number of cells increasing, that's growth. Development is how things adapt and change. If you've ever seen the little images of a fetus when the baby's hand doesn't have any fingers, it sort of just looks, imagine my hand without any fingers, and you just see these little nubs, and then over the next several weeks you see the fingers start to form. That's developing. Those fingers are developing. Yes, they're growing, but that is also a form of development. And then evolution. Evolution is nothing more, as I said earlier, than changes over time. Again, I talked about the TV show Midsummer Murders and the fact that the doors in all those buildings are only this tall and everybody's got a duck to go in them. This is an example of an antibiotic, or the way antibiotic resistance, occurs. You have a group of bacteria. These little green things are representing bacteria. Now, organisms naturally change over time. As DNA reproduces and DNA is made from one cell to the next cell, it's not perfect. Mistakes happen. Those mistakes are called mutations, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on in the semester. But they happen. So what can occur, and this occurs naturally, but what this represents is we've had an adaptation or a mutation that has occurred to cause this one bacteria to be red. And that one red bacteria, due to whatever that genetic change was, now has the ability to reproduce, and it also has what is called resistance to the antibiotic. In other words, this antibiotic here is going to eliminate all the green ones, but it's not going to eliminate the red one. So, as more and more time goes on, what happens to the number of red ones as opposed to the number of green ones? And if you look here, over here, we still have a whole lot of green, but over here, we've got a whole lot of red. If this goes on long enough and happens enough times, we wind up with a bacteria, something called along the lines of MRSA. Everybody's heard of MRSA, MRSA. But what does it mean? It means methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It is a strain of staph that is not susceptible, cannot be treated by methicillin, which is the standard go-to for a staph infection. If you have a staph infection, we give you methicillin. Well, if you have MRSA, methicillin doesn't work because this type of thing has happened. The staph organism has evolved over the last 25 or 30 years. All right. All organisms evolve. Now, if you look at this picture very closely, I know it's hard to see on this camera, but if you pull up these slides on Blackboard or in your textbook, you will see that right in the middle here is a little white thing with little red dots on it. Now, all around it are other little structures that look very similar to this. That's a seahorse. The stuff all around it is coral. The seahorse has evolved to look like the coral in which it lives so it doesn't get eaten. In other words, it gives itself camouflage. It is perfectly suited to its environment. You take it out of this environment, you take a whole bunch of these and put them in some green coral, they are not going to last very long because they're going to stand out. So evolution, organisms have different genes because they change over time. Again, this is just another, some more verbiage about the difference between the way things evolve. So, all things evolve. Bacteria reproduce and evolve very quickly. When we think about generations, when we're talking about a generation of people, you know, my siblings and I are a generation. Our children are a generation. Our grandchildren are a generation. So in human terms, we may think of a generation time as, 20 to 25 years. In bacteria, a generation may only last a few minutes. The generation time, and again, don't worry about this unless you're going to take microbiology, and if you're going to take microbiology, put this in the back of your head. In bacterial terms, a generation time is defined as the amount of time taken for the culture to double in number. So if you've got a bottle that contains 1,000 cells, the time taken for that 1,000 to become 2,000 and the 2,000 to become 4,000, that's a generation time. And in some bacteria, that generation time may be as little as 7 minutes. So again, you're producing that many offspring, that many generations that quickly, they can evolve very quickly. Again, this is our antibiotic resistance. You got the change that made it resistant. And then you've got the antibiotic resistant bacteria are most successful when antibiotics are present. So again, you have to be very careful when you have antibiotic resistant strains of bugs. So those are the characteristics of life. So mastering the concepts from this first chapter, you should be able to understand what is meant by production, by DNA, reproduction rather, evolution, cells, molecules, populations, and mutations. And remember that mutation is that change in the DNA from generation to generation. If I have slightly different DNA than my parents because during DNA replication a mistake was made, then that is called a mutation. Taxonomy. This is the way we categorize life. There are several different ways to categorize life. Different groups are sort of arguing about the best way to do this. I like this system here. It's a two-domain. It's a three-domain system where you have domain bacteria. These are all very common bacteria, the ones we know about. The thing with E. coli and staph and strep and all of those, C. diff and all of those are bacteria. Archaea organisms. The word archaea literally means the ancient ones. And these are the ones that maybe you're not quite so familiar with. They all live in extreme environments. We'll talk about them in a minute. And then the final domain is domain Eukaryote. The separating point between these two and this one is the type of cells they have. Domains bacteria and archaea contain a type of cell called a prokaryote. The word prokaryote literally means before the cell, before the nucleus. These are cells that do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. The word eukaryote means true nucleus, and these are all the organisms that have a membrane-bound nucleus in their cells. The relationships between these organisms. When I was taking this class many years ago, more years ago than I care to remember, over at UALR, we didn't refer to the archaea organisms in their own world. They were considered part of the bacteria. We actually called them an unusual type of bacteria. They were bacteria, but they had this really thing that they lived in these really strange places. They lived in areas where it was really hot. They lived in areas with really high salinity. They had really high pHs. Areas that normal bacteria would be killed, these things seem to thrive in. Well, fast forward 25 years, 30 years, we've now given them their own identity and their own domain. And then the animals, plants, and funguses, and the protist organisms round out life. And so all organisms share some common ancestors. This is just a depiction of the different types of mammals that exist. The one on the far left is a mammal called the duck-billed platypus. It is an animal that lives in Australia, New Zealand. I think there's some in New Zealand and Australia, but down in that deep south part of the Pacific. This is a really unusual mammal. We know it's a mammal because it has fur, and the females produce milk for their offspring. However, it has a rather unusual characteristic in that it lays eggs. It is an egg-laying mammal. The one in the middle is the kangaroo. Everybody's familiar with the kangaroo. Kangaroo is a group of organisms called marsupials. The possum that you see dead on the side of the road lots of times here in Arkansas is also a marsupial. The marsupial organisms have their babies in a very embryological way, but the baby passes outside the mother's body and then must find its way into a pouch where it develops further. And then we have what are called placental mammals, which the human being is a placental mammal. The baby develops fully inside the mother and then is born. Interestingly, in the placentals, there are also two different ways of doing things. Some placental mammals, like human beings, give birth to relatively helpless offspring. If you've ever seen dogs and cats have babies, dogs and cats, puppies and kittens are blind when they are born. They can't hear. Their ears are folded and closed. They can't hear much of anything. They're blind because their eyes are not open, and you know what, that takes a couple of weeks for the puppies and kittens to open their eyes and to be able to fully hear. But other mammals like horses, a baby horse, a foal, can stand up and run 25 or 30 miles an hour within just a few hours of being born. My daughter, Lindy, is 26 months old, almost 27 months old now, and she's just now learning how to run. And she's gotten to the point where she can almost stay ahead of me. I can still catch her, but it's getting close. It won't be long, and she'll be able to outrun Daddy. Again, the 8 levels of the taxonomic hierarchy. I would recommend that you familiarize yourself with domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. I can virtually guarantee you that will be a short answer question on your first exam. It will be, name in order the levels of taxonomic hierarchy from highest to lowest or something. But domain, this is the human being. Domain is eukarya. We are, in fact, animals. Phylum chordata means we have a backbone. Excuse me. Class Mammalia means we are mammals. Order Primates means we're a primate, which means we have a virtually upright. Not all primates stand on their back feet. In fact, most of them go around on all fours. But primates all do share a sort of body structure that lends to, well, everybody's seen a monkey and a chimpanzee and all of those. Those are all primates. So they all have, while they don't stand erect, they all have a sort of upright structure. And there are other things that are characteristic of primates as well. We are the family Hominidae. As far as we know, we are the only member of family Hominidae left on the planet, although some people do believe that there may be some relic populations of certain hominids in certain areas, like Bigfoot up in Washington, and the Yeti in Asia, and some other ones scattered around the world. Genus Homo, and the species for the human being is Homo sapien. Homo sapien, the word is sort of varied over the years. It basically means man, the tool maker, but there were lots of tool making hominid creatures throughout the history. So usually we now just say Homo sapien is what is considered modern humans. Again, tree of life includes three major branches. We talked about domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukaryote. Again, these are the bacteria. These are primarily what you will talk about. If you take a microbiology course, you'll spend a lot of time talking about these. You will also spend a lot of time talking about the protist organisms in a microbiology class. The domain archaea, again, those are those very unusual organisms. They all show some similarities. They all show some differences. This type of structure right here is called a cladogram. It shows, this is the common ancestor for all life. There was some branching pattern that made these different things. I'm not going to ask you to do a whole lot of analyzing of cladograms. This is just showing, basically, if you want to look at it this way, the closer things are to each other, the more they're going to be related to each other. So that's why we have all the plants on one stick and all the funguses on another stick and all the animals on a third stick. Again, we talked about the domain bacteriae. That's a picture of a transmission electron microscope. Doesn't tell me what bacteria that is. And then over there, that's a scanning electron microscope showing different an archaea organism. That's an amoeba. These are very common organisms that we show a lot in middle school and high school. If you're looking at protist organisms in a lab, you're probably more than likely looking at an amoeba. Animals, we all know the animals when we see them. That's a honeybee right there. But animals tend to be multi-cell. They tend to be heterotrophs. They have to eat their food, in other words. Fungus organisms, there's a classic example of a fungus. That is a mushroom. We've all known mushrooms. These are nature's decomposers. Plants, everybody knows plants, multicellular, autotrophs. They can make their own food. Kingdom Plantae. Again, most of us know plants when we see them. Again, we want to master these concepts. You want to know the difference, what a kingdom is, what an organelle is, what DNA is. An autotroph. Autotroph is an organism that can make its own food. A cell, domain, a heterotroph is an organism that has to get its food from somebody else. I have to eat groceries, so I am a heterotroph, and then know how to use energy. The scientific method. The scientific method is how we determine how or what the answer to a scientific or a question in nature is. You see a question and you test it using what is referred to as the scientific method. Lots of steps to the scientific method. Go through them rather quickly. First of all, you make an observation. This just happens to be something about rotavirus causing intestinal upset in babies. So you make an observation. From that observation, you ask a question. After you've asked your question, you consult any prior knowledge there may be out there in the literature, and then you formulate a hypothesis. You say the reason this happened is because. You then make predictions based on your hypothesis. You say the reason this happened is because. That's your prediction. Then you're going to design and perform an experiment to test your prediction. You would then collect and interpret your data. You will then again consult the prior knowledge. You will draw conclusions. And then if your conclusions are valid, you may write a paper, send it to peer review, and have it published. Now, this goes on hundreds of thousands of times every day all over the world. And this is the way decisions are made. We have seen, and as I said coming in, full disclosure, I'm in an empty room with a locked door. That is the reason I'm not wearing a mask. I am not a mask denier. I have been wearing a mask since day one of this thing. However, when people tell you to follow the science about wearing masks, social distance, how many people is too many. None of this stuff has been fully done, because this process doesn't happen in 3 or 4 weeks or even 3 or 4 months. This process can sometimes take years. So one of the big controversies in certain areas of the population around the country was that in March of 2020, Dr. Fauci, the voice of coronavirus in this country, Dr. Fauci said, I don't think masks are really important. We really don't need to, I don't think wearing a mask is going to be really helpful. And then 6 weeks later, he said, everybody wear a mask. Well, from the time I heard this virus existed, I started wearing a mask. I was wearing a mask going into the Walmart and the Kroger long before anybody else was, and long before most everybody was. Because while I wasn't sure scientifically if that mask was going to help me, in my mind, I said, any advantage I can have. Because as the virus started, it was apparent that the people most affected were the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions. And those pre-existing conditions were things like heart and lung issues and diabetes and obesity and several other things. Well, I don't consider myself old, but I'm older than I used to be. I am a type 2 diabetic. I have in the past had issues with blood pressure. I have in the past had a couple of heart issues that, while not life-threatening, were life-concerning. So I saw instantly that if a mask was going to be beneficial, I was going to take advantage of it, and I've worn one ever since. And I may continue to wear one after this thing is over. I don't know. But this stuff, when it comes to, is 6 feet enough? Should it be 12 feet? Is 10 people in a room okay, or is 20 people in a room okay? We won't know the actual answer to those questions for years. But what we do know is the information we are getting, the people who are making those decisions are erring on the side of caution. If they think 6 feet is, if 4 feet is fine, then 6 feet is better, right? So there's my political statement about the coronavirus. Again, wear your mask. We observe, again, make observations about the baby, ask the questions, formulate the hypothesis, collect the data, interpret the data, draw your conclusions, write your paper, have it peer reviewed. Another wonderful example of how this, this situation right here can go out of control. There's lots of information out there. Parents don't want to vaccinate their children because they think that the vaccinations will cause, what is it that the vaccination will cause? Somebody answer. See, that's why it's beneficial to have somebody in the room with me. But anyway, there's a condition among children that some people seem to think that the vaccinations will cause. It is, and the reason they think that, and I keep wanting to say Down syndrome, and I know that's not right. But the reason that happened is because a British researcher did a very small study, wrote a paper. The paper was not properly peer reviewed, but it got published. Well, once it's got published, it belongs here in the prior knowledge area. Whoops. So people, I touched it for too long. So people can always go back and say, well, that researcher did that work that said that the childhood inoculations cause It's really beginning to bother me that I can't remember what it is. But anyway, it's not important. I'm not going to ask you that on the test. Don't worry. Somebody email me and tell me what the dadgum condition is that Jenny McCarthy said her son that has it got it because of his childhood inoculations. We now know that there's absolutely no validity to that at all. And had this paper been properly peer-reviewed before it was published, it wouldn't have happened. But again, use the scientific method. Experimental design, again, you have a sample group. The sample size is much better. You see, whatever these gentlemen are doing, they've got a whole bunch of different samples here. Each one of these represents a sample. I'm not sure what they're doing, but size matters. When you're doing an experiment, you want to have a lot of replicants. You don't want to base your decision on 2 tests. You want to do a lot of different tests. The independent variable, that's the one that you manipulate. The dependent variable is the one that you measure to determine the effectiveness, so you don't mess with that one. And a standardized variable is one that you just maintain the same throughout the whole experiment. A control is a group that's in your test that's not receiving the medication. You're doing a medication study. All of these groups would be getting the medication. Maybe, these folks are getting a dose of the vaccine. The dependent variables, the number of children with the illness caused by the virus, age and health factors, and then finally, these are the ones that are not getting a vaccine. They're getting a placebo to hopefully give us numbers of, they're getting better, and they're getting better because of this. Again, just a statistical analysis showing how the different, you would put your data onto a chart. And then finally, what are the components of scientific inquiry? You have observation, question, hypothesis, etc. Theories. A scientific theory is something that is a hypothesis that has been tested multiple times and has never been falsified. We have the germ theory. The germ theory states that germs can enter the body and cause disease. We have the theory of evolution. We have certain gravitational theories, and those don't have, that's not the law. The law of gravity is, if I take this package of wipes and I let them go, they're going to fall down. That's going to happen every time. That's the law of gravity. Gravitational theories, that's some of those things about things in arcs tend to stay in arcs, and some of those physics things. Take physics if you want to learn about gravitational theory. We try to falsify theories. That's what we try to do in science. If we have or theories are falsifiable, as long as something is not proven false, it can maintain as a theory. And here's the interesting thing about science. We only got to prove it false one time. Just one time of verified false, and that theory will no longer hold water. A English biologist 100 years ago or so, I don't know, it hadn't been quite, probably 70 years ago or so, said, until I find a fossil of a modern rabbit in the stomach of a dinosaur, of the stomach of a T-Rex, I'm going to believe in the theory of evolution. In other words, we've got to find something that completely contradicts the theory of evolution. Now, I know you can see things out there on the internet where people have supposedly found Brontosaurus tracks and human being tracks in the same mud level. Well, you can't really age rock. From age, you have to age living things, and that's one of the problems with aging things. So again, keep in mind, if you see it on the internet, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. The reason we won't let students use Wikipedia as a reference for scientific papers is because anybody can go in and edit a Wikipedia post. Anybody. So, science, the limit of science. You can see the same thing and have multiple interpretations. One scientist can see it one way, and another scientist can see it another. One, researcher may interpret something one way, and somebody may reinterpret it another way. We have slow acceptance of unexpected conclusions. You have something that happens that you weren't expecting, and most of the scientific community won't accept it. Classic example of this, and we may talk about it a little bit later, is the idea of Francesco Redi and his experiments with galls and chunks of beef. And he came to these conclusions, and the rest of the scientific community was saying, yeah, we're not real sure about that. It doesn't sound right. So they were really slow in accepting. And we're limited to existing phenomena of the natural world. We can't pull in the supernatural in science. So, technology is the practical application of scientific knowledge, provides a tool for scientific inquiry. This is the way we are moving forward. We're moving forward very quickly in the scientific world. Charles Darwin, the story of the orchid and the moth is actually kind of interesting. Charles Darwin, who was a very famous naturalist in the 1800s, he found a very unusual moth, and it had a really, really long nose. And he looked at that moth and he said, there's got to be a reason. Excuse me, let me backtrack. He actually found the little flower. And he looked at that flower and the fact that it had this really, really long nectar tube. Now, Darwin knew that for plants to be pollinated, the area down here had to receive the pollen. And he said, well, now how is the pollen going to get from up here to way down here? So he theorized that there would either be an animal, a moth or a bee of some kind, that would have a really, really long nose and a really, really long tongue that could stick its tongue all the way down there and get to the nectar tubes. And lo and behold, 30 years later, the moth was discovered. So, again, things work together, but sometimes they take time. All right, and we're not going to go through the appendix of long descriptions. All right, that took a little longer than I had planned, but we got through chapter 1. If you have questions, please email them to me in the contact section or the messaging section of the course, and we will see you for chapter 2 either next week or on another Collaborate session, depending on how my day goes today. Thanks, everybody. Bye.